In this video, we're going to be going over the method evaluateLight, which computes and returns the status of a light at a given row and column based on the following rules. So the three rules are: if the light is on, return false if the number of lights in its column that are on is even, including the current light. 2, if the light is off, returns true if the number of lights in its column that are on is divisible by 3. Or 3, otherwise return the light's current status. So there's a lot of information in those 3 little sentences. So I would really advise you to make sure you understand this problem before you start to dive into it. Let's go ahead and write out the pseudocode. So for the first thing, we know that we're going to want to be calculating the number of lights in that specific column that's being passed in here for both cases. So we know that there's going to be 2 cases, if the light is on or if the light is off. But in both of those cases, we need to count up the number of lights in the column that are on. Later on, we might have to do something different for the logic to determine if we should return true or false. But for this first step, it's all going to be the same. So we're probably going to want to initialize a variable to hold the number of lights that are on in a given column. Then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to iterate through that entire column. So notice that the thing that's going to stay the same is the column, but the row is going to be different. So as we're moving down the column, we're changing the row. Loop over the column. We're looping over the column. We're looking at the value in every single row of that column. If the light is turned on, increment the number of lights turned on variable, right? So the whole purpose of this loop is just to figure out how many lights are turned on in that given column. Once we exit that loop, what we need to do is we need to determine if the light at that current row column is on or off. So determine if the light at given row column is on or off, and based off of that we're going to be going into essentially 3 different cases. So if light is on, then we also need to determine if the number of lights in its column is even. Determine if number of lights in column is even. So then we will be returning false in that case. If the light is off, we're going to need to determine if the number of lights in column is divisible by 3, all right? And if that is the case, we want to return true. And then if we didn't go into either one of these cases, we just want to return the light's current status. So this would be either true if it's turned on or false if it's turned off. You might think, well, how are we ever going to get into this case down here? If, for example, the light is on, but the number of lights in the column is odd, we would fall through to this case. Or if the light is off and the number of lights in the column is not divisible by 3, we would also fall through to this case. Just because it kind of looks like we won't be reaching that case doesn't mean that it's impossible. So let's go ahead and start writing out the code for this. So we need to initialize a variable to hold the number of lights that are on in a given column. So an int would be good for this. So int num lights on. We can initialize this to 0. You might be tempted to actually check whether the light at the given row column is on or off, but we don't actually need to do any of that pre-computing because it's going to be handled in our for loop. So because that light is a part of the column that we're going to be looking at. So looping over the column, notice here we are only going to need one for loop as opposed to in part A where we needed to loop through the entire 2D array. In this case, we're only going to be looping through one column. So you can kind of think of this as just one array that we're going to be looping through. So we're going to set it equal to 0. And then you might be tempted to use this row variable here that's being passed in. However, this would not actually give you the proper bounds of this for loop. You're actually going to want to do light.length because 2D arrays are row major. This will be returning the number of rows, and that will give you the proper bounds for your for loop. And then we're going to do I++, and then close that up. All right, so now we want to actually determine if the light is turned on at, so we want to set a Boolean value. So Boolean turned on is equal to, we want to grab the value at, we want to grab it from lights, which is our 2D array. Remember that we're using our I to keep track of which row in our column we're looking at. So we would put I here. And then column is staying the same, so we're going to just pass in that column parameter that we're given. If turned on, so if the value at that row and at that column is true, then we're going to increment numLights on. And that should about do it for our for loop. We're going to keep looping through each of the rows of that column, incrementing numLights on as we see lights that are turned on. Next, we want to determine if the light at a given row column is on or off. We need this to determine which of the three cases we're going to be going into. So Boolean, call it light turned on, is equal to lights, which is our 2D array, at row column. So based off of this Boolean, we're going to be going into one of our three cases. So if the light is turned on, with light turned on, so if that's true, we also need to make sure if the number of lights in the column is even. So the way that we would do that is we would add an and statement. These two conditions need to be true, and numLights on is even. So a way that we can test for that is if mod 2 is equal to 0. So if it's divisible by 2, then we want to return false. Return false. Our second case that we can go into is put an else if, because we still need to test two things here, is if the light is not turned on, so we would negate that. So if this is false and the number of lights in the column is divisible by 3, so we would do a similar thing we did in the last if statement, but now mod 3 is equal to 0, then we're going to return true. If we reach outside of this if else if structure, then that means that we didn't find a light that was turned on and the number of lights in the column was even, or the light that was turned off and the number of lights was divisible by 3. So in this case, we just want to return the light's current status. So that would just be returning light turned on, like that. And that should about do it for our actual code. We're given this light board, and then we're given 4 different calls. So the first call is to 0, 3. So that means that the light that we're looking at is in the first row and in the 4th column, so that has the value true. Let's not get ahead of ourselves though. So first, let's go through the code. So numLight on is 0. So for this for loop, we're gonna go from 0 to 7. Then we're going to be grabbing the values as they're being indexed. So this first value will be lights at 0, 3. The column is going to stay the same. It's going to be at 3. This light is turned on, so we're actually going to increment numLights turned on to 1. Then we're going to increment our I. Now we're looking at the next row in that column, which is also turned on. So we're going to increment our numLights turned on. Moving on to the next row, also turned on. We're going to increment that number, next light. This one is not turned on, it's false. So we're not going to increment our numLights turned on. We're just going to move on to the next row in the column. This one also not turned on, so we're not going to increment numLights turned on. And then move on to the next row. This one's turned on, so we're going to increment numLights turned on. Then we're looking at the last row within that column, 6, 3. This one is not turned on, it's false, so we do not increment numLights turned on. So our final value at the end of that for loop is 4. Then we want to determine if the light is turned on for that given row column value that we're given. So that would be 0, 3. It's true, so this value is true. So that means we're gonna be going into that first if statement where we're checking whether the number of lights in that column are even. So this would be true, and number of lights turned on is 4. 4 mod 2 is 0. So this would also return true. So this means that we can go inside of this if statement and return false. And that is the correct value returned for calling this method with 0, 3 for this given light board. If we move on to the next call, it's going to be 6, 0. So the light that we're looking on is the very last row of the first column. I'm going to go ahead and just speed up this for loop because I can kind of just eyeball it, but hopefully you can use the process we used in the last method call to understand how I'm doing this. But basically we're just going through the 0th column, the first column in our light board, and I can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 lights turned on. So at the end of this for loop, we have 6 lights turned on. The value of light turned on for 6, 0 is false. So we're going to be going into the second case here. The inverse of false is true. true, and we're checking whether numLights is divisible by 3. So numLights is 6, divisible by 3 is 6 mod 3 equal to 0? Yes, it is. So this is going to be true and true. So we're going to return true for this case, which is correct according to the problem statement. If we look at the next call, it's going to be for 1. So we're going to be looking at the column number 1. The number of lights turned on in that column is 2. So we can check if the light is at that given row column is on or off. For 1 is off. So we have false here as our boolean, so that means we go into our second case. So inverse of a false is true, and then we're going to check whether numLights is divisible by 3. Unfortunately, 2 mod 3 is equal to 2, which is not 0, so it is not divisible by 3. So we're going to fall into this return case that is just going to return the light's current status, which would be false. So that is what we returned for this third call, evaluateLight at 4.1. And then this last statement, we have 5.4. The number of lights that are turned on in the fourth column are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 lights turned on. We get the value at the given row column value, so 5.4, the fifth row, fourth column, which is true. We'll be going into that first statement. So if the light is turned on, that is true, and the number of lights turned on is divisible by 2, or is even. Is 5 mod 2 equal to 0? Unfortunately, it is not. It's equal to 1, because 5 is not divisible by 2, so we do not return false. We return the light's current status, which is going to return true, and that is absolutely correct for this call to evaluateLight. If we get rid of all the pseudocode, this is what our evaluateLight method looks like, where we are initializing a variable to keep track of how many number of lights are on in the given column. We're looping through that column. We're checking every row in that column and incrementing numLights turned on if we find a light that's turned on. Then we're grabbing the actual value of the given row and column. And then based on that, if that light is turned on and the number of lights in that column is divisible by 2 or it's even, we return false. Otherwise, if the light is not turned on and the number of lights that are turned on in that column is divisible by 3, we return true. Otherwise, we just return the value of light turned on. So hopefully that helps you out with this 2D array problem. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and I'll get back to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.